Welcome to this session of Cornell Notes. Our topic is conflict. The two essentials that we have are first, what makes a conflict effective in a story, and second, how does a conflict influence the sequence of events in a story? So as we go through this lesson, be thinking about both of those essential questions. I will be using Cornell Notes format for this presentation, so please make sure you have your Cornell Notes out, you're taking notes at the appropriate pause times, and I will also be providing you with annotations and some questions in the margins. Let's get started on our first heading. Our first heading is conflict. A conflict is a struggle between opposing forces. Authors use a story's conflict to develop their characters and convey their message to the reader. These are a few annotations that you could make to this note. And one question you can use to study is, for what purpose do authors use the conflicts in their stories? Let's move on to our second heading, which is external conflict. An external conflict involves a character who struggles against an outside force, such as nature, a physical obstacle, or another character. A few annotations are now on your screen. And one question that you can use to study is provide 3 examples of external conflict. Next, we have internal conflict, which is the second kind of conflict. An internal conflict is one that occurs within a character and usually involves making a difficult decision or facing confusing emotions. These are some annotations and a question. Provide 3 examples of internal conflict. Now, I just want to be clear that these are the 2 types of conflict that you're going to be reading about in stories. So external conflict and internal conflict. We're about to learn about 5 main types of conflict, but all of these 5 main types of conflict can be put into the category of an internal conflict or an external conflict. So make sure you understand that. The following are the 5 main types of conflict. First is person versus person, which means a problem with a character. Second is person versus society, or a problem with the law or beliefs held by a society. Third, person versus nature, problem with the environment. Fourth, person versus self, which is a problem making a decision. Or fifth, person versus fate, a problem that seems uncontrollable. Here are some annotations that you can put in there. Notice again that each of these 5 main types of conflict is either external or internal. Person versus self, the 4th type of main conflict that we talked about, is the only conflict that is internal, because the character is dealing with his or her self as he or she is trying to make a decision or deal with difficult emotions. One question you can ask is, provide 2 examples of each type of conflict, and which type of conflict is internal conflict. Let's move on to our next slide here. First heading is conflict and plot. The conflict is closely related to the plot of a story. The plot outlines the events leading up to the resolution of the conflict, and the conflict drives the plot. So remember that the conflict and the plot are closely related. The plot outlines how the conflict is resolved, and the conflict is really what drives the plot forward. These are some annotations of important main ideas. And a question. In what way are the conflict and plot closely related? Our final heading is internal versus external conflict. Many internal conflicts are partially external. When deciding whether or not a conflict is internal, ask yourself whether the character is most concerned with a decision or emotion, or with an obstacle or person who is preventing the character from acting. If the latter is true, then the main conflict is probably more external than internal. This can be confusing for students to understand. So make sure that you ask yourself the question indicated in the slide, and that will help you to decide whether or not a conflict is internal versus external. some annotations, and a question. How can you tell whether a conflict is internal or external? And another, give an example of a conflict that is mainly internal but also includes an external element. That's the last heading of our presentation. Thank you for watching this session of Cornell Notes with our topic of conflict.